What's the definition of flexibility? Flexibility, in my mind, it's somewhat related to the questions that arise in relation to breathing when we talk about breathing, like what's the right way to breathe? Just to frame it in a, because it's a similar genus of question. And the answer is always, well, what are you doing? What's the best way to be breathing when you're sitting quietly in front of a room talking to people, or sitting in a room listening to someone talk, or when you're running, or when you're doing yoga, but not just when you're doing yoga. How about when you're doing a vertically supported standing pose that requires you to balance over a base of support and move your spine? There's a certain breathing pattern that arises in that situation, which is very different than something that's going to arise when, say, you're doing a restorative pose, in Shavasana or whatever. And all of those experiences and everything in between can arise within the context of a yoga class. So even to say what's the right way to breathe when you're doing yoga, drops context. The thing I'm pointing out here is that context is everything for a question like that. So what we say is there's no right way to breathe. It's only a matter of whether your system is free enough to respond to what you're doing appropriately. And I think it's a similar thing with flexibility. Like, how flexible do you need to be in order to do X? The big X being live your life, which is comprised of a bunch of smaller equations, like, for myself as an example, I can get my shoes and socks on pretty well. I can work on my clients. I can demonstrate the things I need to demonstrate when I'm teaching. I can play basketball once a week, which is not enough for me, but it's all I get to do. And I can ride my horses, and I can play with my kids, and I can shovel snow. In other words, I have enough flexibility at this point in my life to do all the things that I want to be doing. Are there some things that might be fun to do that I would need to be more flexible for? Maybe. But how important are they to me is the question. And how much time and energy and effort would I have to devote to going back into some kind of intense yoga training to accomplish them? So in other words, I do my yoga to live my life, not the other way around. And I'm plenty flexible for my life.
So flexibility meaning freedom of movement?
It means having the appropriate and available range of motion to do the activities of your life without injuring yourself. You have enough range of motion to do what you want to do in a safe way. So I think that in yoga we tend to err a little bit on the side of going for more and more flexibility. It turns into sometimes what I like to call the unbridled pursuit of unlimited flexibility. Right? Because there's always another pose that you can't do. I don't care how flexible you are. I mean, what's the end result? To be able to get a job with the Cirque du Soleil? Is that the basic, the end, result of your practice, to be that flexible? So you always have to draw a line somewhere. I don't care how flexible you are. You have to draw a line somewhere beyond which you're simply not going to push. The question is, do you draw the line sort of intentionally, consciously, or does your body draw it for you by simply tearing something and getting hurt, which forces you to stop? It's the hardest thing, I think, for people who do yoga is it's for the people that are more on the flexible side and need to stop themselves before their body stops, to not push to your full range of motion, to set a boundary and respect it, even though you could go further. It's very hard to do emotionally, and it's very hard to do muscularly. It's very hard to stabilize a joint at something less than its full range of motion. And yet that's what we have to do with the more flexible people, to keep them safe and keep them from injuring themselves and damaging their joints. Because the kinds of problems that a flexible person will develop in yoga practice are much more serious and chronic than the sort of acute kind of sprains or strains that a stiff person will develop if they go too far. So yoga is more dangerous for the flexible than for the stiff, is the bottom line. But it does bring up a good question. how flexible is flexible enough? This is why the Swadhyaya is so important. This is why we keep coming back to the actual definition of yoga practice according to Patanjali. You know, tapas swadhyaya ishvara pranidhanani kriya yogaha. You know, the tapas is about changing things, you know, becoming more flexible or becoming more strong, or in any way taking your system outside of its ordinary habitual way of operating. But the Ishvara Pranidhana part of the equation is, these are the things that I should surrender to. These are the things I shouldn't try to change. And the Swadhyaya, of course, is about being able to know the difference. You know, it's that good old serenity prayer rearing its head again. And these are great questions to ask. And that's why we're sort of reframing this whole discussion about flexibility and stretching in Yoga Anatomy 2, the second edition, to make it more of an inquiry, make it more of an exploration. Because as Amy said last week, the most horrifying thing she found out was that people were going through the book and like deconstructing their practice and reconstructing it based on what they perceived as the instructions we were giving for each pose. Do this, do that with this joint, do this with that joint, and that's just kind of, you know, what we're trying to get away from. It's more like this shape of the body involves these actions in the joint, because that's what creates the shape. And then what you're doing within that shape, what you're feeling, what possible sensations could arise, that's what's interesting. You know? So it's a big and interesting discussion, but great question. Yeah, great question. Flexibility is having the range of motion to do what you need to be doing. And that, of course, confronts us with the question, well, what do we need to be doing? That's what your yoga really needs to get you to be thinking about. Not can I touch my toes, but how important is touching my toes to me? And what am I willing to sacrifice in order to do it? Right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have goals, that we shouldn't strive for, you know, for being able to do more and better postures. You know, that's part of the conversation of yoga, but yoga is much more than postures, and it's much more than asana. You know, it's about some really core issues and some really core questions we can be asking ourselves. And the asana practice just provides a very effective mirror for all of those issues. You know, someone hurts themselves in yoga class, maybe they'll be prompted to engage in an inquiry of, you know, well, where am I pushing myself in other areas of my life? Maybe this injury is showing up for a good reason, to show me that, you know, I'm just pushing too hard and striving with too much energy in a particular direction, and I need to back off, you know? And that conversation is, of course, the balance to the other thing that happens all the time in yoga class, where you go in and you see other people who are doing things that you can't do. And you start asking yourself, well, why can't I do that? You know, and how do I need to change my system so that I can do that? You know, that's sort of the given conversation, you know. But the other side of it, unfortunately, only happens sometimes after we hurt ourselves. But that's the balance to that drive, you know. So, great question. And I don't know if it's going to make your struggle any easier, but at least we're talking about it. Okay.